Well, before we begin Romans chapter 6, there's a few things that I'd like to establish beforehand so that it makes more sense as we go through chapter 6 and what Paul is doing there. Chapter 6 is a transition to a new thought in relationship to everything that Paul has been arguing up until this point. And what I'd like to do is show you again the logical steps that leads him up to Romans chapter 6. So we've already seen in his letter to the church at Rome, Paul lays out his thesis. And then Paul begins to talk about the reality of sin making a righteousness from God necessary. So his thesis is that there is a righteousness from God that is received by faith. And then he moves on and begins to talk about the reality and the existence and the pervasiveness of sin. And he argues that both Jews and Gentiles will stand guilty before God. Not just those who have denied him, but even those who have the law and were entered into a covenant with God, they will all stand guilty before God, and God will use the same standard of judgment. Just because they have the law doesn't mean that they are free from condemnation. Then he goes on to speak about how God has brought about salvation, how God is offering for sinners to be forgiven and to be justified. And he does this by talking about the reality of justification by faith. And then he goes on in chapter 4 to defend the reality of the concept of justification by faith by using the example of Abraham. And then we saw in chapter 5 the results of justification by faith, which is peace and joy and so forth and so on. And he goes and compares Jesus to Adam to show that the work of Jesus is deeper and greater and as far-reaching as Adam's actions were. And now Paul moves on into a new topic in light of what he has established before, and it's the concept of sanctification. And in order for us to understand what Paul is about to begin to talk about, I want to introduce you to two important terms that we've already seen one of them throughout the book of Romans thus far, and that is the doctrine and the concept of justification. Justification is the act of God whereby he declares someone who is sinful, someone who is guilty. God declares them in the same way that a judge in the court of law declares someone not guilty. God declares a sinner righteous in his sight. God declares a sinner to be righteous. Just some important facts about the concept of justification, as Paul has already touched on and laid out in his section on salvation. Justification is a positional change. So when you go into a legal system, you have a criminal who is indebted to the court because he is a law breaker. He's indebted. He is considered a criminal. He's an enemy of the state, and he is in a debt before the courts. Now, justification in the same way, justification is a positional change where God then declares someone who is guilty to be not guilty. In the same way that someone who comes into the court and says, I confess, I committed the crime, I am a criminal, God says you are not a criminal. Your position and your standing before the court has changed. You are no longer a debtor before the court. You are no longer obligated to the court in that manner. This is a standing before God. Our standing before God has changed. We're no longer criminals, no longer enemies of God, but we have become children of God through faith in Jesus Christ. And what justification does primarily is that it removes the guilt of the sinner. You're no longer tagged as a criminal before God. Now, not only that, but when your position and your standing is removed, then immunity from sin's punishment is granted. You no longer are obligated to the punishment that comes with the crime. You no longer are obligated to serve the punishment or to pay the fine for the crime that was committed. Now, here's an important aspect of justification, which will then lead Paul into the next topic that he's going to talk about in Romans chapter 6 all the way to chapter 8. Justification does not make a person righteous practically. It doesn't make a person righteous practically. In the same way that if you go into a courtroom and you committed a crime and you're guilty and the judge declares you to be not guilty, that means the court is no longer legally binding on you. You are free from any punishment or stipulations. But if you actually did commit the crime, you're still guilty. You're just not legally guilty before the court, but you are guilty. And this leads us to the next concept, which Paul now will discuss. And that concept is the concept of sanctification, the biblical doctrine of sanctification. Sanctification is the process by which God makes a person holy and righteous practically. And I want to point out something. It's a process where God is the one who is doing this. God is the one who sanctifies us in the same way that God is the one who justifies, the one who declares righteous. God is also the one who is at work in a believer to make them holy and righteous practically. And what I mean when I say practically is in actuality, in our everyday life, as we live out life, we are being conformed into a righteous and holy standard. Righteousness deals with the power of sin. The influence that sin has on our life is being removed by God. Justification and sanctification cannot be separated. They flow logically and naturally. A person who is justified will be sanctified. Once justified, a person will begin the process of becoming more like Jesus in their thoughts, their words, their behaviors, and their deeds. I like the way it's said that the person who is not sanctified has never been justified. Sanctification is a natural, inescapable consequence of having been justified. If God declares you righteous, then God also has his hand on you and has begun the process within you of changing your mind, your thoughts, your words, your deeds, and your heart, your desire, causing you to talk like Christ, speak like Christ, think like Christ, have the mind of Christ, behave like Christ, love like Christ, forgive like Christ, and to walk as Christ walked. So a person's confession must be validated and confirmed by their practice. If there is no practice of Christ's likeness in a person's life, there is no true justification that has taken place. It's just a confession that is without proof. So these terms are necessary in order for us to begin to understand what Paul then says and discusses specifically in Romans chapter 6.